So the symbolists, here are some of the most prominent symbolists in the world. There's Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon, Steve Muggleton in the UK, and Ross Quinlan in Australia. And their idea is actually a very interesting one. It's to think of deduction, it's to think of learning as being the inverse of deduction, right? Learning is induction of knowledge, right? Deduction is going from general rules to specific facts. Induction is the opposite. It's going from specific facts to general rules. So in some sense, one is the inverse of the other. And so maybe we can figure out how to do induction in the same way that people in mathematics figure out how to do other inverse operations. Like, for example, subtraction is the inverse of addition, or integration is the inverse of differentiation, and so forth. So, as a very, very simple example, right, addition gives you the answer to the question, if I add 2 and 2, what do I get, right? Subtraction, and the answer, of course, is 4. And this is the deepest thing I'll say in this whole talk. And subtraction, of course, gives you the answer to the inverse question, which is, what do I need to add to 2 in order to get 4? The answer, of course, being 2. Now, inverse deduction, right, works in a very similar way, right? So here's a simple example of deduction, right? You know that Socrates is human, and you know that humans are mortal, and the question is, what can you infer from that? Well, of course, the answer is that from that you can infer that Socrates too is mortal, okay? Now, the inverse of this, and that's when it becomes induction, is if I know that Socrates is human, what else do I need to know in order to be able to infer that he's mortal? And of course, what I need to know is that humans are mortal. And so in this way, I have just induced a new general rule that humans are mortal. Of course, in general, I wouldn't just do it from Socrates. I would do it from Socrates and, and a bunch of other people. But that's the general way that this works. Okay? And then once I've induced rules like this, I can now combine them in all sorts of different ways to answer questions that I may never even have thought of. And this kind of flexibility and compositionality is actually something that of all the 5 tribes, only the symbolists have. Now, of course, these examples are in English. Computers don't understand natural language yet. So what they use is something like first-order logic, right? So these things, both the facts and the rules that are discovered are represented in first-order logic, and then questions are answered by chaining those rules, by reasoning with them, okay? So, but whether it's in logic or in natural language, the principle is the same, okay? And as I said, of all the 5 paradigms, this is the one that is most like scientists at work, right? They figure out, like, where are the gaps in my knowledge? Let me, enunciate a general principle that will fill that gap, and then let me see what follows. Let me see if it's correct given the data. Let me see what gaps I then find, and so on. And in fact, one of the most amazing applications of inverse deduction to date is actually a robot scientist. So if you look at this picture, the biologist is not the guy in the lab coat. The guy in the lab coat is actually a computer scientist and machine learning researcher by the name of Ross King. The biologist in this picture is this machine here. This machine is a complete automated biologist. It starts out with basic knowledge of molecular biology, DNA, proteins, RNA, and all of that stuff. And then what it actually does is it formulates hypotheses using inverse deduction. It designs experiments to test those hypotheses using things like DNA sequencers and whatnot. That's what's on there. It physically carries them out, right? So it does the whole process with no human help. And then given the results, it refines the hypothesis or comes up with new ones and so on. Okay? Now, there's only one of these robots in the world today. Its name is Eve. There was actually a previous one called Adam. And Eve last year discovered a new malaria drug. And the thing that's amazing about this is that, well, once you've made one robot scientist like this, there's nothing stopping you from making 1 million. And I have 1 million scientists working on a problem where before maybe all you could afford was a few. Okay? So this can really speed up the progress of science. And I would say that in areas like molecular biology, there is no hope of really understanding, for example, very well how cells work without this kind of thing, right? There's just too much information for human beings to discover on their own. Okay. Now, this is one very